global integration, including in the U.S., and that is something that needs to be monitored also very closely because it will have spillovers in the rest of the world. Now, having said that, if we look at actually what has happened...
For decades, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, was seen as one of the most cautious institutions when it came to crypto. Back in the mid-2010s, IMF officials repeatedly warned that digital currencies were too volatile, too risky, and could destabilize global finance. Fast forward to 2025, and the tone has shifted dramatically. At the IMF spring meetings this year, digital assets weren't just a side panel, they were front and center with discussions on CBDCs, tokenized liquidity, and the integration of blockchain into global financial stability frameworks. Why the pivot? It comes down to three forces: institutional adoption, regulatory clarity, and geopolitical necessity. The IMF no longer sees digital assets as an experimental playground for retail speculation. Instead, it views them as part of the infrastructure shaping how countries settle trade, manage reserves, and stabilize their currencies. One of the most striking outcomes from the IMF's 2025 Digital Finance Forum was the recognition that cross-border payments remain broken. The system is slow, costly, and fragmented, exactly what crypto projects like XRP, Stellar, and HBAR were designed to fix. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva acknowledged that for emerging markets, remittances and cross-border liquidity are lifelines. That's where the IMF's mission, ensuring financial stability and equitable access, collides directly with what blockchain can deliver. Take XRP. It has already proven itself as a bridge asset, connecting CBDCs and fiat rails. At the summit, case studies were presented on how XRP's liquidity pools could reduce foreign exchange slippage for smaller economies that struggle with dollar shortages. Meanwhile, Stellar XLM was highlighted in sessions on financial inclusion, where its partnership with MoneyGram and local payment operators in Africa and Asia was showcased as a live example of how blockchain can lower remittance costs. Then there's HBAR, which entered the conversation around governance and compliance. Its Enterprise Council model offers exactly the accountability the IMF insists upon in its guidelines for financial infrastructure. The biggest sign of change? The IMF is no longer simply warning against digital assets. It's now proposing frameworks for their use. Draft papers from 2025 emphasize the need for global interoperability standards, tokenized liquidity management tools, and even the possibility of a digitized SDR, special drawing right. Imagine an SDR that isn't just an accounting entry between central banks but a programmable digital token running on rails like Stellar, XRP Ledger, or HEDERA. That concept was unthinkable 5 years ago. Today, it's being openly discussed. In short, 2025 marks the year the IMF shifted from spectator to architect in the digital asset space. And for projects like XRP, Stellar, and HBAR, this isn't just validation. It's an entry point into the heart of global liquidity management. Liquidity management has always been the IMF's bread and butter. Since its founding in 1944, the fund has intervened when nations faced currency crises, balance of payment deficits, or reserve shortages. Traditionally, that meant issuing loans in hard currencies, usually the US dollar, and imposing structural adjustment programs. But in 2025, this approach is showing cracks. Global debt is at record highs, US dollar liquidity is unevenly distributed, and geopolitical fragmentation has made reliance on a single reserve currency more fragile than ever. Enter the digital liquidity debate. For the IMF, the challenge is no longer just about lending dollars. It's about creating new tools to manage liquidity in a world where digital assets, tokenized bonds, and CBDCs are moving value across borders at speeds traditional banking systems cannot match. The fund now acknowledges that failing to adapt risks making it obsolete as blockchain-based networks begin providing liquidity solutions outside its purview. One statistic raised during the 2025 IMF spring meetings drives the urgency home. Cross-border payments still cost, on average, 6% of the value transferred. For developing economies reliant on remittances, countries like Nigeria, El Salvador, or the Philippines, this is a devastating inefficiency. Liquidity doesn't just flow expensively. It flows slowly. Settlement can take days, often through correspondent banking chains that expose small economies to FX volatility and cut them off during crises. For the IMF, which exists to maintain financial stability, this is no longer tenable. That's why digital liquidity solutions have entered the conversation in 2025. And this is where XRP, Stellar, and HBAR become directly relevant. The IMF's working paper on CBDC interoperability cited Ripple's pilot projects with over a dozen central banks. The issue is clear. If each country issues a CBDC in isolation, they will be no more interoperable than today's fragmented fiat currencies. The IMF's role is to ensure cross-border cohesion, and XRP's use case as a neutral settlement layer aligns with that mandate. Imagine a scenario where a country like Kenya, short on US dollars, can still settle trade with China through a CBDC to CBDC corridor powered by XRP liquidity pools. Instead of going through multiple intermediaries, the transfer would be instant, cost-effective, and supported by transparent on-chain auditing. This doesn't eliminate the IMF's role. It actually expands it, since the fund could oversee governance standards while still leveraging XRP's efficiency. Stellar's contribution is not about central banks but people. Its rails are designed for microtransactions, remittances, and last-mile liquidity access. At the IMF summit, Stellar was positioned as a case study for reducing remittance costs in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. For families who rely on money from abroad, Stellar's network provides not just efficiency but survival. The IMF's concern is ensuring equitable liquidity distribution. In practice, this means making sure a villager in Ghana sending $50 home doesn't lose $10 to intermediaries. Stellar's model, integrating with mobile money platforms, money transfer operators, and even NGOs, demonstrates how liquidity can be democratized. IMF officials acknowledge that if they want to meet the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, supporting blockchain rails like Stellar may be less about ideology and more about necessity. Where XRP and Stellar focus on liquidity rails, HEDERA HBAR introduces something the IMF deeply cares about: trust and governance. The IMF has always stressed accountability in financial systems, and HEDERA's governing council model provides exactly that. A permission structure where global corporations, universities, and organizations validate transactions. At the Digital Finance Forum, HEDERA's emphasis on tokenized assets and compliance was highlighted as a potential template for tokenized liquidity facilities. For example, a country facing a liquidity crunch could issue tokenized bonds on HEDERA's network, with settlement and auditing streamlined in real time. This aligns with the IMF's goal of improving transparency in sovereign debt markets, which are notorious for opaque practices. Perhaps the most groundbreaking discussion in 2025 revolves around the special drawing right SDR. Traditionally, the SDR is a basket of major fiat currencies: dollar, euro, yen, pound, and yuan, used by the IMF to provide liquidity support. But what if the SDR itself was digitized? A digital SDR, DSDR, could be a programmable, blockchain-based asset issued directly by the IMF. Instead of just bookkeeping entries, countries could transact DSDRs in real time for trade, debt repayment, or reserve rebalancing. Networks like Stellar, XRP Ledger, and HEDERA were explicitly mentioned in technical papers as possible backbones for such a system. The benefit? Countries wouldn't be hostage to slow SWIFT transfers or FX bottlenecks. Liquidity would move as easily as sending an email, with programmable compliance ensuring the IMF retains oversight. While this is still speculative, the fact it's being discussed openly shows how much the landscape has shifted. Of course, the IMF is not abandoning caution. Officials continue to stress the risks of crypto volatility, illicit finance, and systemic shocks. But the narrative has shifted from outright rejection to controlled integration. The IMF now envisions itself as the body that sets guardrails, establishing standards for digital liquidity while allowing networks like XRP, Stellar, and HEDERA to do what they do best. In this sense, the IMF is not competing with blockchain. It's harnessing it. The strategy is to integrate these networks into a hybrid system where digital assets improve efficiency but oversight remains centralized under international frameworks. If there's one thing the IMF has repeated over the past 2 years, it's this: digital assets won't reach their full potential without legal clarity. And that's not just about regulation at the national level, it's about creating a global framework. After all, liquidity is useless if assets move freely in one jurisdiction but hit walls in another. The IMF's core legal concern is cross-border standardization. Each country is racing ahead with its own digital asset rules. The EU has MiCA, the US is still wrestling with whether tokens are securities or commodities, and Asian economies like Singapore are building pro-innovation but heavily licensed frameworks. The result? A patchwork system where money can flow faster than the law can follow. That's a nightmare scenario for the IMF, which exists to ensure global stability. This is where the conversation around XRP, Stellar, and HBAR becomes critical. These networks are already engaging with regulators and building compliance features. Ripple has positioned XRP as a compliant liquidity tool for central banks. Stellar has partnered with entities like MoneyGram and development banks, embedding itself in regulated remittance corridors. HEDERA, with its governing council model, offers a blueprint of how decentralization and oversight can coexist. The IMF is taking notes. At the 2025 World Bank IMF Summit, officials emphasized the need for digital trust frameworks. These would function much like today's banking regulations, setting standards for KYC/AML, consumer protection, and systemic risk monitoring. The difference is that, instead of slow-moving intermediaries, blockchain protocols themselves may need to bake compliance into their code. HEDERA already does this by design. XRP Ledger is exploring compliance overlays. Stellar integrates with identity solutions for remittance providers. Another pressing issue is sovereign debt transparency. Countries are drowning in opaque obligations to multiple creditors, many of which are not publicly disclosed. By requiring debt issuance to be tokenized on transparent ledgers, the IMF could solve one of its longest-running problems. Here again, HEDERA's emphasis on tokenization and governance makes it a likely candidate. Stellar's ability to handle small-scale retail instruments could support citizen-level bond participation. XRP's liquidity function could backstop cross-border debt settlements. But legal clarity is not just about frameworks, it's about legitimacy. For years, crypto has carried the stigma of being a shadow system. By openly discussing blockchain integration, the IMF is effectively signaling that certain protocols are moving from the periphery into the mainstream legal financial order. This doesn't mean every crypto will survive, but it does mean that assets like XRP, Stellar, and HBAR, which already align with policy goals, stand to benefit disproportionately. The endgame for the IMF is to avoid a two-tier world where regulated fiat flows operate in one silo and unregulated crypto flows in another. Instead, the fund is working toward a hybrid global liquidity network where digital assets complement, rather than challenge, fiat oversight. That means the next decade will be less about banning and more about integrating under rules everyone agrees to. For XRP, Stellar, and HBAR, this legal shift is the most bullish signal yet. It transforms them from speculative assets into infrastructure candidates for the future of global liquidity. As the IMF looks ahead, its biggest challenge is how to merge traditional liquidity tools with decentralized networks without creating chaos. For decades, the IMF has acted as the global lender of last resort, deploying special drawing rights, SDRs, and emergency loans to stabilize economies. But in today's digital-first world, those mechanisms feel slow and outdated. What if liquidity could be mobilized instantly, transparently, and across borders with no reliance on intermediaries? This is where blockchain integration becomes not just attractive, but essential. Imagine a future IMF liquidity framework built on a hybrid network, SDRs tokenized and issued on permission chains for governments, while liquidity settlements flow through public ledgers like XRP Ledger, Stellar, and HEDERA HBAR. In such a system, XRP would handle high-speed, cross-border liquidity swaps between central banks and commercial institutions, providing real-time settlement for IMF-backed support packages. Stellar would operate as the public-facing layer, distributing funds for remittances, humanitarian aid, and small-scale financial inclusion initiatives. Its MoneyGram integration already hints at this use case, with Stellar acting as the bridge between global liquidity pools and unbanked populations. HEDERA would underpin governance, ensuring tokenized SDRs and debt instruments meet regulatory and compliance requirements. Its governing council model, which includes global enterprises, universities, and public organizations, mirrors the multi-stakeholder structure the IMF relies on. The brilliance of such a system lies in interoperability. No single chain could carry the entire burden of global liquidity management. Instead, by layering these assets, the IMF could combine speed, XRP, accessibility, Stellar, and governance, HBAR. This approach also neutralizes one of the largest criticisms of blockchain in global finance: fragmentation. A hybrid IMF system would effectively curate the strongest features of each protocol into one seamless liquidity pipeline. Critically, such a network would not replace fiat. It would complement it. Tokenized SDRs would still represent claims on reserve currencies like the dollar, euro, yen, and yuan. But instead of waiting days for settlement through correspondent banks, these claims could flow instantly through digital rails. This accelerates the IMF's ability to respond to crises, whether it's stabilizing Argentina's peso, backstopping African debt, or funding reconstruction in post-conflict regions. Of course, this transformation raises questions. Who controls access to the rails? How are governance disputes resolved? And what level of decentralization is acceptable for a system tied to sovereign interests? These debates will dominate the IMF's next decade. But what's clear is that XRP, Stellar, and HBAR already offer living case studies of how such a network could function. Each has been tested in payments, tokenization, and compliance at scale, making them less speculative and more infrastructural. In the end, the IMF's liquidity role is evolving from lending money to managing trust in digital liquidity flows. Blockchain protocols, once dismissed as fringe, are now candidates to become the very rails of tomorrow's global safety net. The IMF is no longer just the lender of last resort. It's positioning itself as the architect of global digital liquidity. What began as cautious reports on crypto in 2018 has, by 2025, evolved into a serious exploration of tokenized SDRs, blockchain-based liquidity corridors, and interoperable settlement rails. And in that conversation, XRP, Stellar, and HEDERA stand out. Each brings unique strengths. XRP's high-speed liquidity routing, Stellar's inclusion-focused payment networks, and HEDERA's enterprise-grade governance model. Combined, they form a triad that could shape how the IMF transitions from traditional liquidity allocation into real-time, transparent, and programmable global finance. The question isn't whether the IMF will embrace blockchain, it's how quickly and which networks will earn its trust. For investors, builders, and policymakers, the opportunity is massive: to align with protocols that may soon carry the lifeblood of global markets. So here's the takeaway: don't just watch this evolution. Position yourself inside it. Study how XRP, Stellar, and HEDERA are weaving into the IMF's digital narrative. Because when the next liquidity crisis hits, the rails of global finance may not be banks but blockchains.